Today we're going to be talking about language used in content areas, and we're going to be discussing the differences and similarities. Every content area has a different language that they use, and it is important that students understand when it is appropriate to use these different languages and recognize when language that they have used in one content area crosses barriers into another content area. Often the sciences and math overlap, and social studies and language arts overlap, but students will also begin to notice the overlaps in all content areas. It is important that students understand the language used for each content area so that when the content areas begin to overlap, they are equipped with the tools and the vocabulary that they need to comprehend their readings and do the most effective writing for each assignment. In the K through 12 levels, math will typically use language that is, as we learned in our Zygouris-Coe readings, abstract, complex, and a bit difficult to communicate. Vocabulary in math must be precisely defined, and vocab can have a range of meanings from general to specific. Much of math language is practical, meaning that it must be demonstrated in order to be understood, where memorizing definitions will be relatively useless. Some terms used in math will be terms that are also used in other content areas, but take on a different meaning in relation to math. A few examples of words that might do this are volume, area, derivative, and limits. These words are used in very specific ways when related to math, and students may have a difficult time understanding the change in meaning in relation to the content. Math also uses symbols as a part of its language. Students have to be able to recognize different symbols as stand-ins for words or phrases. Sometimes the words that change meaning in relationship to math can also be expressed by a symbol, so not only do students have to shift their mindset to the new meaning of a word, but they also must memorize that new meaning with a new symbol that they haven't been introduced to before. Science uses somewhat similar language to math, but with some crucial difference. Science also has many words that take on new meanings when introduced in a scientific setting. An example of this that Zygouris-Coe gives is an image, which colloquially means a photograph or the way a person is perceived, but in science, the word image means a copy of an object formed by reflected or refracted rays of light. Other common words that take on specific meanings are element, reaction, reflection, and wave. Science can have some memorization of definitions, but in order to truly understand the language, students will need hands-on experience, well-thought examples, and in-depth discussions with their teachers and peers. Scientific language uses nominalization, which are nouns that leave out syntactic information. Students are used to reading sentences that sound something like this. It will take 9 to 12 days to mature. But in science, students will get a sentence that reads, maturation takes 9 to 12 days, where the nominalization in the sentence is the word maturation. The lack of the syntactic information that the word maturation gives would make science more difficult to understand for some students. Since science is saturated with specific terms, teachers must be aware to gradually introduce students to new terms by selecting essential vocabulary for each unit, so students do not become overwhelmed with the new information. Social studies focuses much more on memorization of facts than any of the other subject areas because of the language of social studies, which is not usually practical. In many K through 12 social studies classes, students learn about past events and their language is limited to what has already happened. However, in some higher level social studies courses that students might get in high school, students may learn more practical knowledge in classes like government or human geography. Even so, much of the content in these classes still relies on memorization and not practical uses within the context of the class. Due to the nature of social studies, it introduces a lot of language and vocabulary that is only used in a certain context and will not be used again, unlike science and math, which continually builds on the same language that students have previously learned. Since there's a lot of memorization, teachers must remember to focus on conceptual knowledge and not expect students to remember every specific detail. The last of the major subject areas, language arts, which is my field, uses language that many students would recognize as the type of language that they use in everyday life. However, there are many different genres in the area of language arts, and authors may use language for different purposes based on the students need to be able to distinguish the nuances in language based on the genre. Now, heartfelt nonfiction text, the sentence, "She loved her mother dearly," would mean exactly what it says, but in a story about an angsty teenage girl, the same sentence would likely be used sarcastically. There is a lot of vocabulary in literature that is used to describe a general concept or writing style, which may be hard for students to distinguish. The language is not as cut and dry as the other content areas, with definitions that are flexible and concepts that are hard. Students should be acquainted with the vocabulary in language arts, but not be expected to have mastered it within a few days. Students will gradually understand the nuances of language arts as they are introduced to new texts and writing styles. Students come from many different backgrounds and come into classes with different language sets. Students can come into a classroom with vastly different vocabulary, whether it be that they are English language learners or students that speak the same language but come from different areas. In language arts, the tone of a text can be very difficult for students to discern, especially if English is not the student's first language. The example I gave earlier about sarcasm might be very challenging to identify for a student who is struggling to translate in their head as they read. Students should be encouraged to practice general concepts in their own language or at a simple level in order to get acquainted with the concept, so that all students have a basic understanding of the content material, no matter their linguistic background. Just always remember to consider the language demands of the lesson, consider the learning opportunities for all students during the lesson, and consider the communicative functions needed from the students in planning a lesson.